Let's return to that strong gospel preaching. Move quickly away from this emotionalism. That's just a fad. It will come and go. We're always wanting to tell them, well, there's a God-sized hole in your heart, and if you come and you have this emotional experience, you'll be filled up, and all sorts of things like that. That's not going to appeal to men.
There's not a time zone in which he's not being praised. Listen to me, there is not a moment since the resurrection of Jesus where there's not someone somewhere declaring that Jesus saved.
Well, as we think about what does it mean to be a man, where do we go to find that information out? Where do we look? Where do we turn? Now, for many of us, obviously, we started with our father, or for some, maybe a father figure, depending on how you grew up, whether your father was in your life or not, and to what extent. And some of you maybe even had a father and a stepfather, depending. My generation's really the first generation that you see kind of the rise of divorces and, if you will, broken homes. And so, like many of you, myself, I had a number of examples, some good, some bad. I've got my father, who's been a good example of what it means to be a man. My stepfather, who passed away this past year, was a good example. Then along the way, I've had some bad examples. Won't name them by name, but anyway, I think about another good example was my grandfather, my father's side, a great example as well. So I think about, where do we learn? Now, where do we go as Christians to find out what does it mean to be a man? Now, I know some of our ladies are listening, but I can tell you this, ladies, this is good for you, because this is something you can talk to your husband about, or for those of you unmarried, something you can be looking for in your future husband. And if you are a mother of sons, something you need to talk to your sons about. What does it mean to be a man? Where should they turn for the resources, for the information? Let's start with the Bible. And so this is what we find in the Bible. We find that man is created in God's image, or certainly so are women, and the Imago Dei, but that man was chosen, selected to lead, to if you will, to manage, to lead, to govern. Now, that doesn't mean that women don't have a role in any of that. So I'm saying this, I'm going to say it now, and then I'm going to be done for this episode saying it. I'm going to focus on men in this episode. Men are called to lead. This is what we see. You see this in young men, particularly when I've seen it in my sons when they were younger. They begin to rebel against their mother. And I've noticed, I've had to tell other fathers this as they're watching their sons rebel against their mother. You two things here have to happen. One, you got to recognize that they are acknowledging inherently they've been designed to lead, and they've been designed to lead their future wife, their future children, and so they're acting out on attempting to want to lead their mother. Now, you have to push back as a father. You've got to come in and say, okay, that's not happening. I'm the head of this home. And so then you are to model for your sons and daughters, but particularly your sons, what it looks like to lead your wife well and to love her well and to respect her. That's what you're to show. So when we see what's happening? Well, we're seeing this in society. I believe that there was an article that came out not too long ago, maybe it was a year or two ago, I can't remember, but it had 4 men on the front of the cover of the article, and it says the rise of the beta male, and it had these 4 guys lined up, had each one standing behind the other one, the man reaching around the other man, putting his hand in his pocket in a pose that no man that I associate with would ever conduct himself that way or even pose for such a picture, let alone put his hand in another man's pocket. And so I found the picture repulsive in many respects. Now, when I say the article is, what the idea is the article is wanting to push back against this traditional idea of a man. I also want to push back on some forms of the idea of a quote-unquote the masculine man. A masculine man can love the arts. Let me just be very clear. A masculine man doesn't have to be the loudest man in the room. A masculine man doesn't have to be a bodybuilder, okay? Now, I can also say this: a bodybuilder may not be a masculine man. So these definitions or categories are sometimes very arbitrary. That's like saying someone who plays an instrument. Let's say someone plays an instrument in an orchestra. That he could be an alpha type. He could be a strong man. There's nothing wrong with playing an instrument. There's nothing wrong with liking the arts or other things like that. But you can be a strong man, love the arts. You can be a strong man and love woodworking, or if you will, hunting or fishing. All of those things. That's not the point. Those are just activities. Let's get to the principles. So when we recognize that something's happening, I think we've hit the zenith, if you will, of this if you will, the rise of the beta male, the rise of the effeminate man. I think we've seen it's at its zenith right now. Why do I say that? Because we have a generation that's coming up that's revolting against it, and rightfully so. Now, listen, I've worked well with a number of different people over my span of my lifetime who have a number of different personality types. So I don't mean that there's like one ideal personality type. I don't mean that. And I think what you'll see in a minute when I'm talking about that alpha masculine male, I'm really going to be talking about the biblical man. That's really where I want to go with this. I want to talk about the biblical man because that's where we should go. This idea that masculinity is toxic is an attack, it's an affront on biblical principles of manhood. And we need to restore these. We need to restore them to the entities and organizations that we're part of. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to be jerks. That doesn't mean we come in and we're headstrong and we're jerks about everything, or that we demand that there's only one way to do it and it's my way. That's not what I mean here. What I mean is that we're governed by principles, and when those principles govern us and govern our behavior and govern our lifestyle, I think that we're going to see outcomes where people want to follow us. They're going to see integrity. They're going to see discipline, things that are important that they really are looking for in a man. I remember growing up hearing things like, well, he's a man's man. And I really know what that meant till later on. And I kind of realized that it's a man that other men appreciate being around. It's a man that other men aspire to be like or can count on or trust. In some respects, that's the kind of man that we should want to be. Here's the thing. I got kind of a breakdown. So I'm part of Generation X. Generation X follows the boomers. In many ways, we thought we were the lost generation. In some respects, we are. When it comes to the church particularly, we were the generation that they basically said, let's just give them a kickball and some pizza, and then just occasionally mention Jesus with very little expectations of them. And now we see that generation has been negatively affected in the church. In fact, from what I can see in churches, Generation X has the lowest representation of devout, committed males in the church. So what happens when Generation X is being obliterated by this seeker-sensitive, consumer-friendly approach to quote-unquote church? What happens is that the Gen X men, many of us grew up, we grew up outside where you rode bikes, you got dirty, you got hurt, you got in a fight down the street, and this is just normal things that happen during the day. You'd be left home alone, at ages now that probably would get you in trouble. We stayed outside all day. We drank from water hoses. We didn't wear helmets when we rode bikes, and all sorts of things, right? So masculinity is still inherently strong. That is true, solid, sound masculinity, sound principles of masculinity is still strong within Gen X. But the problem is that Gen X, as we kind of came out of that, the late teen stage, many of us, didn't think church was important. Now, I thank God I was saved at 21 years old and realized that it was. So what do you do now? You have this void. Well, here's what happens in that void. We see the church moving towards hyper-emotionalism. Church is becoming very effeminate. Since that becomes the new ethos, that means that it's drawing in more and more effeminate men, drawing in more and more women who are now taking on positions of leadership. Well, what's that going to do? That's going to continue to push out strong men. The strong men aren't going to want to be in leadership. They're not going to want to be associated with it. We see the decline of strong men going to seminary to pursue the pastorate. We can look around us and see that in many respects it's a profession that's being disrespected because of the lack of strong male leadership. So when we look at Gen X and we say, okay, what comes next? Well, we have Gen Y, and this is where we really see that the prevalence of the beta male and the effeminate male rising into positions of leadership. Now, and I want to be clear here. The idea of having a revival requires us to wake up. And so as we see our young men waking up, this is what's happening in Gen Y. Now I want to kind of give you this. So Gen X, basically frustrated, those are some of the hardest men to reach. Those are some of the hardest men to convince of the value, the inherent value of being part of the local church. With Gen Y, there's a group. If you notice, there's a group that's waking up. They see the value of the church. Why? Because there's a resurgence amongst Gen Y of theological studies, right? They're interested in theology. They're not just going to say, well, this is what I was taught, or somebody told me that. That's more, and with all due respect to my boomer friends, that's more a boomer thing, right? I don't really need to study it. I just was taught it. And the people that taught it to me, well, that's good enough. And so I'm just going to hold on to what I was taught. Well, with Gen Y, they're pursuing things. They want to know why. They're investigating. Well, what that's caused, it's caused a resurgence of theological interest amongst Gen Y. Well, that theological interest, if you're going to pursue theology from a biblical perspective, you're going to see the value and importance of the church. When seeing the value and importance of the local church causes somewhat of it's causing a conflict for them, because on the one hand, there is this clear theological thread running through the New Testament that shows the value, the inherent value of the church, the importance of the local church, the importance of the universal church, the importance of raising our children in a gospel community, to be part of a covenantal community. They're seeing that. At the same time, they are seeing churches that are either dying off, or that some are espousing a secular model. Many have gone woke. And then you find churches being, in many cases, being overrun by effeminate men. So what do? Well, there's a waking up that's happening. This is a good thing. There's a waking up that's happening amongst Gen Y, and this is a good thing. Why? Because they're a generation younger than me. I pray as the revival starts with them. I told a friend of mine of this 15 years ago. I said, listen, this next generation younger than us, the focus here isn't this seeker-sensitive focus. We need to drop that. We need to drop all this quote-unquote church growth stuff. Now, there's nothing wrong with your church growing. There's nothing wrong with trying to reach people. But I said, we've got to move away from this, and we need to get back to teaching sound theology. Not that he and I weren't teaching sound theology, but like many others, we also at times were falling prey to the church growth movement. I can remember as a young pastor, I took my church through the 40 days, the Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Life and Purpose-Driven Church. Now, I'm not here to knock that right now. That's not my point. I'm not here to build it up or tear it down. My point was I got caught up in it as a young pastor, a young preacher, and thought that was how we're going to reach everybody. Now, whether you love or hate the book, that's not the point. The point is this. I got caught up in the movement. Did a correction course and said, no, the real answer here is to teach the next generation of men and women theology. I think about the great hunger that was espoused for theology during the First Great Awakening. That's really the difference between the First, Second Great Awakening, if you ask me. The others have difference of opinion. I have a number of reasons there's differences, but one difference is the first one was really rooted in sound theology. The second, we see the focus being on methodology, and I think that was the clear difference in my mind. However, we can pick that matter up later. So we see amongst Gen Y, there's a waking up amongst these men. Amongst Gen Z, though, there's a clear line drawn. So while Gen X is checked out, Gen Y, they're waking up. Many of the men in Gen Y are waking up. That's the millennials. And then within Gen Z, there's a clear line. Why? Because there's a resurgence that's already beginning amongst Gen Z of alpha masculinity. And what we're seeing now is that's affected what we're calling Generation Alpha, because while in Gen Z there's just a clear dividing line. You either are or aren't. The lines aren't blurred anymore. With Generation Alpha, that is that next generation, they are the most conservative generation in, I believe, the last 40 or 50 years of young men coming out of high school. If you will, the percentages of the young men being polled coming out of high school, it's the highest level of conservative thinking men that we've seen in several generations. Now, for some this is alarming, for others this is exciting. So what we have here with the Generation Alpha is a new hope. That means we need to think through these principles. Now, I'm just going to give you basically a couple here, what I believe here. First of all, when I say a biblical man, an alpha-type man is a leader of his home. This is a man who can lead and lead well. And because he can lead his home, because that's where leadership starts. If you can't lead your home, you're not going to be able to lead anywhere else. So he leads his home well. And because he leads in his home well, he's able to lead in other places. Whether it's in the micro or the macro, you can count on this guy to lead. Now, he doesn't always have to be out front to lead. Listen, you don't always have to be the loudest or out front to lead. There's a whole number of variations of leadership styles and approaches, and even leadership postures and positions. You don't have to be the loudest in the room, and you don't have to be the one out front to lead. Although a leader may be the one who is essentially the loudest in the room and the one out front. You can also lead through wisdom and influence, patience. You think about the old sage who sits and listens and waits to speak, and then when he speaks, everyone else listens. So, but this is someone who's a leader of their home, and someone is confident because he's competent. That's key. This is someone who's confident because he's competent. This is what I mean by the alpha type leadership. An alpha does not need to tear down anyone else to promote himself. He doesn't need to do that. He is confident because of his own competency. He is the cream that's going to rise to the top. Now, a couple things I want to point out here. I want to give you, in the scriptures we find in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, Paul basically tells them to act like men. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 13 through 14, I draw your attention to these verses because I think, if we're going to root what we believe in Scripture, we need to find some case studies, examples, principles that we can draw from. So at the end of 1 Corinthians, obviously Paul has had to address a number of issues at Corinth, a number of issues, from theological to sociological behaviors, relationship, sin in the camp, a whole host of things. But he ends with this. I think this is interesting. As he's wrapping up, he says, "Be watchful," in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13 and 14. "Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. Let all that you do be done in love." You say, wait a minute, you lost me in verse 14. No, let's talk about this, because a strong alpha type male is a man who understands what it means to love. Now, we're going to define love based on the Bible, not based on some secular principles. So notice here what he says when he's telling them to act like men. First of all, be vigilant. Carries with it the idea of looking for enemies, guarding. So what does it mean to act like a man? It means guard. Now, men who guard their families, these are the kind of men we want to lead in the church. A man who can't protect his own family can't protect the flock. We want men who can lead and lead well. These are men who understand that other people aren't our enemies, but the enemy is the evil one, the Satan himself. And these are men who understand that other people are not our foes. They are the ones we seek to evangelize and to express and communicate the gospel to. They understand we're looking out for enemies. We're not looking out necessarily for people per se. That is when we're talking about it from an ecclesiastical, from a church perspective. But we are understanding that ideas and ideologies are the enemies of the gospel. Now, when I'm protecting my home, if someone shows up at my door with a weapon, obviously they're the enemy. And so in that context, yes. But I'm talking about when we're talking about the gospel. So they're willing to stand guard. But he also says, stand firm in the faith. That is, be unmovable. Do your job. Work hard. This is what a real man looks like. All this is to be done in love. Now, by love, he doesn't mean a weak, emotional, or sappy concept. That's not what it means. I've heard of it. Well, people just know if we love them. They don't know what that means, and frankly, unbelievers don't care. If that's the mantra for your church, you're going to be very ineffective at reaching real men. You say, well, just let them know that we love them. Real men, they're not listening to that. So what do we mean when he says act like a real man and everything needs to be done in love? That is understanding love based on the character of God. When God shows love, it's dedication, it's faithfulness, it's loyalty, it's sacrifice. That's what biblical love is. It's not this weak, sappy emotionalism. Now, love is an emotion. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that. And when I think about the emotion of loving my wife or loving my children, loving my friends, loving my church, loving my Lord, I think about it means that I'm loyal, that I'm dedicated, that they can count on me no matter what, that I'm willing to sacrifice for them. Well, a couple last things here I want to point out. Paul uses all kinds of masculine language. I love it. It's funny when we think about the way Paul talks. It's countercultural today in many respects. In 2 Timothy 4:7, he says this, and we need to talk Bible. When we talk Bible to men, men respond. Over the years, I've heard people say, well, the Bible's just for women and children. Well, that's because whoever was telling you about the Bible apparently did not understand these principles. He didn't understand how to talk Bible to you. So let's talk a little Bible to our men today. Paul says this, I have fought the good fight. Well, that's masculine talk. I'm going to tell you that right now. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Think about how inherently strong that is. Let's talk to our young men using this language, using this type of language. Demand of them, hold their feet to the fire. Demand that they fight the good fight, that they finish the race, that they keep the faith. Why? Because I'm telling you, young men are drawn to the gospel when the gospel is preached from a position of strength, not a position of weakness. The gospel is not weak. The gospel is not it's not weak. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation. Let's return to that strong gospel preaching. Move quickly away from this emotionalism. That's just a fad. It will come and go. Emotionalism has been prevalent in the last few generations because of the prosperity of this nation. And so we're appealing to people who already have everything. And we're always wanting to tell them, well, there's a God-sized hole in your heart. And if you come and you have this emotional experience, you'll be filled up and all sorts of things like that. That's not going to appeal to men. Here's what will appeal to men, is that when we teach them that you don't need others' approval, praise, or adoration. A biblical man does not need others' approval, praise, or adoration. Now, I will tell you right now, let me just go on the record. There is, first of all, when I say two people, I don't mean two people, but okay, first and foremost, I do seek to, if you will, have the approval of my Heavenly Father. Okay, so let me be very clear. I want to live my life that I would honor my King, the Lord Jesus Christ. So absolutely, a real man absolutely lives in a way that he seeks the approval of his Lord. But I will tell you this, I'm just going to tell you, I'm a real man, but there's one person whose approval that I long for, desire, and want, and that's the approval of my wife. And let me tell you something, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that, man. You keep seeking her approval. Okay, now I don't mean that. Now listen, don't get me wrong here. I don't mean that means that you lead the way a woman would lead. No. I mean that I want to lead with strength because I want to impress her. I want to lead with integrity and character because I want her to feel safe. I want to work hard because I want her to know that she's going to be taken care of. That's what I mean by winning her approval. By doing all the things a man should be doing, and then knowing that real godly women want a real godly man. So we're going to teach our young men that, look, you don't need the approval of others. You just seek the approval of your Lord. Real men know what really matters. That is an alpha type, a biblical type. They know what really matters to them. So their priorities are focused in the right direction. That's what we need to be teaching our young men. Get your priorities straight, get focused in the right direction. I had a young man tell me not too long ago, he says, my life, I got to get my life on track. Okay, serve the Lord. Get married, get a job. Now, 2 and 3, obviously, get a job, get married, whatever. Do them simultaneously. I would imagine her father's going to want you to have a job before he says yes that you can marry her. Number 3, teach our men that the alpha type, the true masculine man, has high standards. He has high standards for himself and for others. Never, ever apologize for high standards. Don't you ever apologize for high standards. You hold your young men, you hold the young men in the church to high standards. You hold the men around you to high standards. Why? Because when we do that, we recognize that we are sharpened. That's when iron sharpens iron. Look, you will not be sharpened without some friction. Remember that. Number 4, he's a man of his word. We want to teach our young men to be men of their word. Their yes is yes and their no is no. That's what it means to be an alpha type. Number 5, he's not afraid to lead. Doesn't have to be out front. Doesn't have to be. I'm surrounded by a whole group of alphas. And I'm telling you right now, I don't have to be out front. Now, in many respects, I am because I'm the pastor, so I am out front. I'm called to be out front. But a number of situations, I'm sitting in meetings, and I don't have to be out front. Capable, competent men around me who are more than capable of leading. So, we've talked a lot about being a man. So here's the thing. Let us do this. I think inherent in biblical manhood is serving the Lord Jesus Christ. Therefore, being a true man means this: you've given your life to Jesus Christ, 100%, completely, fully dedicated to Him, living for and loving Him. By loving Him, being willing to sacrifice for Him, being dedicated to Him, being determined to carry out His will for your life. That's what it looks like. So, until the nations are converted, there can be no excuses. Why? Because Jesus Christ is King. He's not just my King. He's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords.